Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be trying to figure out how journalistic truth is made.
Oh, that's a big one.
Yeah, it is, right. And we're going to be doing that by looking at this academic thesis
Okay.
that has a pretty unique approach. It looks at the process of making the news using these examples
Interesting.
from real-world newsrooms in places like Turkey, Serbia, Nepal, and Sri Lanka.
Yeah, it really is a fascinating approach. It moves away from that typical debate of do journalists find truth or make it?
Right.
And instead, it uses this framework based on the work of the philosopher Bruno Latour.
I have to admit, I'm not familiar with Bruno Latour.
His work is really interesting. He focuses on these things called modes of existence.
The modes of existence.
Yeah, basically, they're like the different ways that societies figure out what they believe to be true.
Hmm.
So think about it like this. How we determine truth in science is totally different from how it's determined in a court of law, right?
Right.
Each of those has its own, like, distinct system and rules.
So each of those would be its own mode of existence.
Exactly. And Latour's point is that we often get these things mixed up.
Okay.
We try to apply the rules of one mode to another where they don't really fit.
Yeah.
Like when people talk about believing in evolution
Right.
as if it were a matter of faith rather than scientific evidence.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah.
So this thesis asks, where does journalism fit into all of this?
Hmm.
Is it about finding truth? Is it about constructing it?
Right.
Or is it something else entirely?
That's such a good question. And it definitely seems like there's something more to it than just those two options.
Right.
So is this thesis saying there's like a separate mode of existence for journalism?
That's right. The thesis argues that journalism is its own unique way of creating truth.
Okay.
And it does this by building these things called chains of inferences.
Chains of inferences.
Yeah.
All right. You're going to have to break that down for me.
Think of it like a literal chain, right?
All right.
Each link in that chain is like a piece of information, a source, or a decision about how to frame the story. Journalists sort of connect these elements together to create a strong chain.
Okay.
But each link also involves like transformation.
Transformation.
The information is not just passively passed from one link to the next. It's analyzed, synthesized, and then presented
Gotcha.
in a new way.
So it's not just about gathering the facts.
No.
It's about how journalists connect and present them.
Right.
And that's what makes it journalism. Do you have an example of like how that works in practice?
Yeah, sure. The thesis talks about this sports reporter who's working on a story, and he needs to just confirm the names of the players for a football match. Seems pretty straightforward.
Right.
But he consults multiple sources, phone calls, websites, even his own notebook,
Wow.
just to make sure he gets those names exactly right.
Wow.
So it's not just about finding the names, it's
Yeah.
about building this chain of verification.
Interesting. So even something that basic requires building these chains.
Right.
What about a more complex example?
Well, there's a really interesting case study about an investigative journalist.
Okay.
She's working on this story about art smuggling,
Mm-hmm.
and it all starts with just this tiny little detail like a missing painting. But as she does more research, she connects all these documents,
Right.
databases, interviews,
Yeah.
and she ends up uncovering this whole network of illegal activity.
Wow.
So she's not just reporting what happened, she's revealing these hidden connections by building this chain of inferences
Right.
that helps us understand the bigger picture.
Wow, that's so cool. And the story is believable because of how strong and resilient that chain is.
Exactly.
It can withstand scrutiny, like you were saying before.
The thesis also talks about this news aggregator
Okay.
who creates this daily newsletter for Turkish audience using news sources from all over the world.
Wow.
Even deciding what stories to include
Hmm.
and how to frame them is part of building that journalistic chain.
I can see how this framework could apply to so many different kinds of journalism. So what makes something truly journalistic? Like, how can we tell if a chain of inferences is strong?
That's where this thing called the Felicity condition comes in.
Okay.
It's kind of like the defining quality that makes something truly journalistic.
Hmm.
This thesis describes it as resilient, timely signage.
Resilient, timely signage. I gotta say, that sounds a little complicated.
Yeah.
Could you explain what that means?
Sure. So resilient means that the information in the story
Okay.
can hold up to scrutiny and challenges.
Yeah.
Just like we saw with that investigative journalist,
Yeah.
right? Timely means that the information is relevant to what's happening in the world right now.
Mm-hmm.
And signage means that journalism should act as a guide, helping us make sense of what's happening all around us.
So it's not just about giving us information. It's about making that information meaningful and helping us see the world in a new way.
Exactly.
So would that mean that the opposite, the implicity condition, would be information that's like easily disproven, irrelevant, or just confusing?
Exactly. And the thesis gives this really interesting example.
Okay.
It's about this news report about the Sri Lankan president returning from exile.
Okay.
The thing is, the report was written before he arrived.
They published a news story about something that hadn't even happened yet.
Yeah.
That doesn't sound very timely.
Well, it's a good example of how journalistic truth can sometimes operate on, like, a different timeline.
Okay.
The journalists had very reliable sources.
Okay.
They were confident that he would be returning that night. So they wrote the story in advance.
Wow.
It was a calculated risk, a sort of preemptive claim that shows how journalism is often future-oriented. And of course, he did arrive as predicted, making the story part of the historical record.
That's pretty wild. They basically created signage for an event that hadn't happened yet. And because they did, it like shaped how that event was understood.
That's right.
But earlier, you mentioned how journalistic truth can get mixed up with these other modes of existence. Can you tell me more about that?
That's where it gets even more interesting. The thesis uses the term crisscrosses to describe how elements from these other modes like science, law, or politics can actually become part of a journalistic chain.
So like when a politician tries to present their agenda as street news.
Exactly.
It feels like that happens all the time these days.
That's a perfect example. The thesis has this case study of a government news website, and they're reporting on this new initiative to reduce prices. Now, they're trying to present it as just a straightforward news story. But it's also pretty clearly a form of political communication. They're trying to walk this tightrope between their journalistic goals and their political agendas.
That's tricky.
Very tricky. And there's another example about this breaking news app that's trying to cover these protests and social upheaval. But they run into these limitations with their server capacity. And suddenly, their ability to report on the news is restricted by technology. It's a good reminder that even in like the digital age, journalism is vulnerable to these types of crisscrosses.
We've gone from verifying names to like the complexities of politics and technology, all through this lens of journalistic truth.
It's complicated.
It is, yeah. This framework has definitely given me a lot to think about.
Yeah, it's a fascinating approach because all of these crisscrosses don't like invalidate the idea of journalistic truth. Instead, they highlight all the compromises and challenges that journalists face like every day as they work to create this resilient, timely signage, especially in a world where truth is constantly being debated and redefined.
That makes sense. But this whole framework makes me wonder, like, if anyone can publish anything online these days, how can we possibly know what to trust?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think this framework gives us some tools to like think critically about the news that we consume. It encourages us to look beyond just the surface and consider the sources, the potential biases, the choices that shape the information that we're reading or watching.
It's like we're learning to see the man behind the curtain. But that can feel overwhelming. How can we become more discerning about the news? Are there any like tips or tricks?
Well, one of the most important takeaways, I think, is that journalism isn't just about reporting the facts. It's about creating meaning and helping us make sense of the world. So when you're reading a news story, don't just take it at face value. Ask yourself some questions.
Like what?
Who produced this information? What are their motivations, their potential biases?
It's like checking the credentials of the person who's telling you this is the truth, right?
Exactly. What sources are they using? Are they named? Are they credible? Can you actually trace the chain of inferences that they've built?
It's like being a detective following the trail of breadcrumbs to see how the story came together.
Exactly. And then think about how the information is being presented. What choices did they make about framing, language, and emphasis? Every link in that chain involves some level of transformation. So consider how those choices might influence your understanding of the events.
You really have to consider like the craft and the artistry involved in creating a narrative. Because it's not just about the facts themselves, it's about how they're put together to create meaning.
Precisely. And maybe most importantly, ask yourself if the information can withstand scrutiny. Is it resilient? Can you find other sources that either support or challenge it?
So it's like testing the strength of that chain, right? to see if it can hold up under pressure.
Exactly. So instead of just passively absorbing information,
Right.
we need to actively engage with it, question it, and evaluate it.
I like that. So it's less about just blindly trusting or distrusting
Right.
and more about understanding the intentions behind the information we receive.
Exactly. When we understand the process, we can have more thoughtful conversations about what journalism is and what it can do.
Mm.
We can move past that really simplistic idea of fake news versus real news
Right.
and start to engage with the complex ways that meaning is actually created.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive.
Good.
I feel like I have a whole new perspective on how to approach the news. It's funny, we've been talking about how journalists build these chains of inferences,
Yeah.
how they navigate all these crisscrosses, and how all of that leads to this idea of resilient, timely signage. But doesn't that also suggest that there are limits to what journalism can actually do?
That's a great point, and the thesis definitely touches on that. Journalism is powerful,
Right.
but it's just one way of understanding the world. It's not like a cure-all or anything.
So we shouldn't expect journalism to, have all the answers.
Right. Journalism has a very specific purpose, right? To create that signage that helps us navigate current events.
Right.
But it's not the only way to figure out what's true.
Okay.
We can look to science, law, ethical frameworks, our own personal experiences.
Right.
We need to look at all of those things, too, to really get the full picture.
There's journalism is one piece of a giant puzzle, not the whole thing.
Exactly.
But if that's true, how do we keep from becoming cynical? How can we have faith in a shared understanding of truth when it seems like everything is so fragmented these days?
That's a huge question. And I think this thesis actually offers a reason for optimism.
Okay.
When we understand how journalistic truth is made all those chains, crisscrosses, and negotiations,
Right.
we can see just how much effort and care goes into the process.
So it's less about blindly trusting or distrusting and
Yeah.
more about understanding the intentions behind the information we receive.
Exactly. When we understand the process, we can have more thoughtful conversations about what journalism is and what it can do.
Mm-hmm.
We can move past that simplistic idea of fake news versus real news
Right.
and start to engage with the complex ways meaning is created.
This deep dive has given me so much to think about. I feel like I have a new appreciation for journalism, both the craft and the challenges involved.
Yeah.
What's the one thing you really hope our listener takes away from all of this?
I think the most important thing to remember is that in our age of information overload, we can't just be passive consumers of news.
Right.
We have to be active, engaged, and critical.
Mm-hmm.
Don't just scroll and click. Take the time to pause, reflect, and ask questions. And maybe even more importantly, seek out different perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
Journalism that provides resilient, timely signage is out there.
Yeah.
But we have to learn to recognize it, appreciate it, and use it to make thoughtful decisions about the world around us.
That's a fantastic message. Thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listener, until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep looking for those chains of inferences that help us make sense of the world.